Kia ora whanau. As promised, today we're gonna do some shiitake inoculation. It's a rainy day, it's an indoor job, it's perfect for the winter months when you should do it. Ideally when the trees are dormant, the deciduous trees we use, winter is the best time. So you might remember the video we did a few months ago where we did stump inoculation. So you have seen some of the basic things about shiitake inoculation, but now we use the same thing on logs. There might be a few differences that I would like to point out, and also it is one of the few processes here on our diverse farm that is kind of very repetitive, almost like a conveyor belt job. And so it's very important that you get the right tools and the right workflow, because if you want to supply your family with shiitakes all year round, I would say you should aim for something between 50 and 100 logs that you do every year. That would give you a good supply of shiitake if you don't have other mushrooms coming onto your table. So logs, in this case here it's a flame tree log and it's not shiitake. I just want to show you how inoculation works on a log. So with these flame tree logs we put wood ear in, so we drill a hole here, here and there to inoculate with wood ear. That is a very minimalistic inoculation, but wood ear is much more aggressive than shiitake. It normally happens by itself, but we facilitated that process. So we want to get more wood ear into our environment, so we did hundreds of little logs like that. And in this case I want to just show you how the mycelium spreads in a log. So the wood fibers are longer than they are wide. So the spread of the mycelium after inoculation travels faster along the log than across the log. That's why when we go over to shiitake, we have the spacing along the log further apart than across the log like that. And just to have a look how it has developed since, I'm going to cut into the point of inoculation to give you an idea what happens here. So you see this discoloration here, that's mycelium spreading, and it's actually quite slow. The reason for that is flame tree stays active for quite a long time, and as long as a log is sort of not getting the idea that it is dead, it can have certain defenses. So it will take a while with flame tree to get over that. Other wood seem to be dead quicker than flame tree. We all know that I could probably still use that flame tree log and put it somewhere and would still grow, even so I cut it half a year ago. But other logs are not like that. So from the point of inoculation it is spreading across here and then it travels lengthwise. So now back to the shiitake logs. What is a good log? First of all, anything coniferous doesn't work. Pines, totara, nothing works for shiitake. There might be other mushrooms like Inoculating that can handle, lion's mane can handle certain conifers, but not shiitake. So we need a broadleaf tree. Ideally we cut it about a week prior to inoculation, so the log already gets the message it's dead, doesn't have any defense against it. And we don't leave it longer than say a couple of months, because then it will become infected with other fungi already, which compete with what we try to get in here. And then what type of broadleaf? So here we have a selection. So here's pecan. Pecan is really good, and so is alder. Alder is probably my favorite. Then we have pin oak. Oaks is traditionally used for shiitake in Japan. That's where it naturally grows on, and it is supposedly the tastiest shiitake comes from oak logs. We don't get normal oak easily, so but we have a bit of pin oak. So oak is a very dense wood, So once we inoculate that, for the same amount of work of inoculation, we get a longer production span out of it. And that's the reason why we don't use poplar. It's not that poplar doesn't work, but we get a crop out of poplar for 1 year and then it falls apart and that was it. But for the same amount of inoculation work on an oak, we get 5 times the amount of mushrooms over 5 years, 6 years, let's say, but for the same amount of time that we spend on inoculation and the same cost of spawn. So therefore, the harder, the denser the wood, the more we get for the work and the money that we put into it. So it's not that poplar doesn't work, but it is not worthwhile for us. So then we have experimented over the years what other logs would work. For instance, Pohutukawa, here the native here, it's an evergreen, supposedly not as good as deciduous, but it works. It's not brilliant, but it works. If that's all you have, Pohutukawa does it. It's quite a dense wood, but certainly not as good as alder or oak and pecan. Now, every time you do shiitake, focus on logs that you know do work. But then I have come across exceptions as well. For instance, you look on the internet and you find heaps of information that, for instance, in Brazil, all shiitake pretty much is produced on Eucalyptus grandis. Well, we don't have Eucalyptus grandis and we use Salicna, we use Botroides and whatever we can find here. Eucalyptus has not worked for us at all, so that was disappointing. The internet also tells you that Tasmanian blackwood works well. Hasn't done it for us, but a friend of ours had great success with it. So it can be a bit temperamental, but nevertheless, every time you do inoculation run, do some experiments. See what is abundant in your situation. Try it out, you might be surprised. For instance, 1 year we did a bit of macadamia. It was a total winner. So macadamia I would definitely recommend. And being related to Riva, I would imagine that would work as well. So if you have a lot of Riva, give it a try. This should work as well. Today we're going to try with Inga bean, because now we get to a phase in our food forest where Inga bean becomes available as logs. It's quite a dense wood and it's a good firewood, but we have a lot of good firewood here. Tea tree, eucalyptus, that doesn't work for shiitake. So if a wood works for shiitake, then that's for us the most important thing. Firewood is secondary, there's enough of that. Yeah. So we will try for the first time how shiitake works on Inga bean. And so all of you should always give some effort into trying new things and share that knowledge. It's not everything on the internet that works. Now, what is a good log? The length that you cut it is about ideally like that. Anything longer like this one here is going to be awkward, it's going to be heavy, and it might not fit in a bathtub. In order to trigger fruit forming, mushroom forming, we want to soak the logs in a bathtub for 24 hours and then stand them up again. So there's a lot of log movement involved later on in the process. If the logs are too heavy or too long, you're gonna hate it. You don't want logs to stick out one end of the bathtub. They have to be submerged completely, otherwise it doesn't work that well. So I probably cut that one in half rather than leaving it as a long one like that. And then the diameter. So this is pin oak, and that would be absolute minimum for a log. But then it depends again how dense it is. Yeah, a dense wood, we can use smaller diameters because they last sufficiently long to be worthwhile. But if it's a light wood like alder, I wouldn't go as thin as that, not worth it. Why is it not worth it? Because it will maybe only last a year or two. So there's a lot of handling and drilling, all of those sort of things, and then it only lasts a year. What's the point? But if you're short of suitable wood, by all means use it. The advantage of using small diameters like that, they start producing earlier, right? So you might find the same wood, this one would produce after a year, and that one might take a year and a half or 2 years to start fruiting. So there's the difference too. And in general, a denser wood will start fruiting later. So that alder here might start fruiting after 8 months. That Portocava might take 2 years because it's denser. So then what else makes a perfect wood? A perfect wood is something that doesn't have any damage to the bark. For instance, this Portocava here, you see the bark has been knocked off in transport. You try to avoid that, especially if they then sit around for a while, because other mushroom spores can land on it, germinate, and already enter that area, creating a competition. Yeah. And what happens when you have a competition is that that area here might be occupied, for instance, by a turkey tail, and these areas here might be then colonized by your shiitake. So you do all this carrying logs around and soaking them and so on, and you only get 2/3 of the log into your shiitake production, and the rest is something else. So there's that. Then any branch opening like that, same thing. It opens your log up to contamination, especially if the branch has already been rotten for a while. For instance, like this one here. See, there is already a fungus going into the log, and the way that it would look inside is that that branch would make a cone right into the center of the log that belongs to that branch. And as that branch died back, it got colonized by some fungus, a turkey tail or heaps of other fungi that can do that. But as long as that pecan was alive, it would compartmentalize that infection to that little cone here. But as soon as we cut it and store it, that mycelium that's active in here will start running out into the rest of the log. Now that means right now that has been sitting around for 2 months, that mycelium might have spread already like so. So we don't want that. So what we do in this case here, we cut it off here, because also there's a split here in the log. That means more infection going on. So we need to trim them to get a clean log. So I'm going to cut that one off. So you see, there's already contamination in here. So the log might already be ruined because it has advanced too far. Yeah. So see, there is a discoloration going through there. So that log looks like it would be a waste of time. So that is the problem, is letting logs with injuries sitting around for too long. Two months was too long for that one, so we missed out on that. Yeah, this one we cut only a couple of weeks ago, so even so we have incursions, we have rot going down from branches here. At least it should be contained in that area. And when we inoculate, what we will do is we're going to put a few more logs around these contamination sources to stop that other fungus spreading at the same speed as the shiitake. Yeah. So wherever another mycelium is already present in the log, it will stop a competitor coming in. So the faster your shiitake is occupying that zone around that damage, the quicker you stop the spread of that other competition, right? So what tools do we have? We can use a cordless drill, makes it easier. And so this one doesn't work. So you can use a cordless drill. Along the edge, we put definitely another one in here because it's where contamination comes in. But you see the distance is quite wide, lengthwise, as I pointed out before, because the cells are long and narrow. So the obstacle to spreading for mycelium is getting into the next cell. So once they're in a cell, poof, they quickly spread through the cell. But crosswise, it takes longer because each cell wall is an obstacle. So that's why we put the next line like so. That way they're closer together across the log than lengthwise in order to equalize that spread. Yeah? Why we do that like so is we want to maximize the effect of the spawn, because the spawn is your only cost that goes into these logs, right? And depending where you source your spawn, it can vary between $1 per log up to $10 per log. There are some suppliers that do dowels. Yeah, they're mycelium infected wooden dowels that some people use. And that is quite fast, but we found over the years it's not worth going there because they don't have the same energy as using grain spawn. And they're also a lot more expensive. Yeah, so if you go to some hobby suppliers and get spawn, dowel spawn, a single log might cost you something like $10. So after a few trials with dowel spawn, we just stayed with grain spawn. It's just so much more powerful jumping onto the log than a dowel spawn is, and it's so much cheaper. So I would definitely recommend it. It has its downsides, but it's definitely worth using it. So as a rule of thumb, for every inch in diameter of a log, you put another line of holes in it, right? So this is 3 inch roughly. So we're gonna make 3 lines of holes in there. And this one here, well, this is maybe 2 inch, but since the holes go right into the center, 1 row would do with that one. We make an exception on that, but as you go up 1 inch diameter increase, another row of holes. There are faster ways of drilling still than that, and more ergonomic if you want to do a lot. You can buy these little inserts here from Field and Forest in the States. They go a lot faster on an angle grinder, which has higher revolutions, and it's easier on the shoulder doing that than doing that with a drill. So, and then the next step is the spawn. So this is Shiitake spawn from Prince Mushrooms. This year we got a new strain. We have used a strain for over a decade now, but sometimes it's good to come up with a new strain. They have a certain biological clock to them. So this is a new strain we're going to try. The smell of Shiitake spawn is incredibly addictive. It just you want to just eat that stuff. And there's a problem as well with that. Actually, rats and sparrows like it. They find it quite irresistible. So that's the downside of using grain spawn, is you have to protect it against rats and sparrows in the first week at least. After that it has taken off and will be okay. But yeah, you want to protect your logs somehow from those guys. And then we made these things here. You can buy them again from Field and Forest, and we made them out of aluminum pipe. I showed them in the other video before. You have the center coming out a bit further, so we push it below the bark, so we have some room for putting some wax on. Yeah, so we open it up, put the spawn in. So that's a tedious job. Dowels are a bit faster than that, but again, if the log doesn't work because your dowels are just not doing the job well, then that doesn't help you much, right? So now we have the spawn in there, and then books tell you dribble hot wax on it with the idea that the wax sterilizes the area and prevents diseases and so on. I think that's nonsense, because by drilling through the bark, your drill bit is going to take down any trichoderma competition molds that are on the bark. They live on there. They will be carried into the howl. It's impossible to keep that out. So whatever you think that you're sterilizing on the end is not going to cut it. So we have to trust that the grain spawn is so strong that it will run over these contaminations and colonize the wood, and it does. We have never found any issues with that. So forget about the hot wax. I went off the hot wax years ago when I did courses with students, and the hot wax, like having a deep fryer sitting next to you with hot wax, was just too dangerous, and it's too cumbersome, and it takes too long. You have to wait for the wax to settle before you turn the log, otherwise you spill it all out again. So all of that was just too awkward. And then we went for grafting wax, which is practically Vaseline. That works well. And now we use lanolin just because we have it, and it's a natural product versus Vaseline as a petrol product. I'm sure you could come up with something better with beeswax and oils that settle and become hard over time, because the downside with both Vaseline and this lanolin here is that it doesn't harden. And therefore, for the next years to come, whenever you move your logs around, you actually get it on your clothes, which is a bit annoying. And it also creates a sticky plaque on your first mushrooms that come out. So all of that is a bit annoying. So if you want to figure out a recipe to make your own beeswax oil wax with some solvent in it that evaporates over time and it dries out, that would be ideal. And we haven't taken the time to do that yet. We should someday, but it works, and it does a good job, and it's easy, and it doesn't stink, and that's it. Yeah, so that will give you a bit of a head start, because a lot of insects would want to get into this as well, like sliders, slugs, vetas. They are all interested in eating your grain out of here, but that sticky stuff or any cover really will stop them long enough until the mycelium starts jumping onto your wood, and that only takes a few days really. Yeah, so that's how that goes. So each log roughly takes you about 10 minutes, the whole thing, depending on how big they are. And then after that's done, you store it horizontally somewhere on a pallet. It has to be off the ground, otherwise you have mycelium from the soil going into it as well, competing with it. And you don't want the bark to be on the ground either, because it will make the bark rot off fast and then it peels off, and that spells the end for your mushroom production. The bark is very crucial for shiitake. There are some mushrooms that don't depend so much on the bark cover, such as wood ears. You can have a log that's totally peeled off its bark and it still keeps producing wood ears. With shiitake it's not quite like that. So that's another reason why certain logs work better over others, is how long does the bark stay on. Yeah, and that's where poplar is a bit of an issue. The poplar bark comes off really quick and that's it. The protection is gone. Yeah, so we need logs where the bark stays on nicely. Portocava is a good one. Banksia is a good one for that. Alder somewhere in between. Macadamia turned out really good for that. So these are factors that make a wood ideal for shiitake. It has to be broadleaf, ideally deciduous, ideally it's dense, and ideally the bark stays on. That's what makes a good log. And don't experiment too much with stuff nobody has done. Start out with something that is known to work. Real winners for us are alder, oak, liquid umber. They're absolute surefire logs. Portocava, Banksia, Inga bean, we don't know yet. We'll let you know in a year. So anyway, you put them away on a pallet, no soil contact, horizontally, in the shade for a year. Keep the rats off them. You have to poison them or pet them, whatever. Keep the sparrows off, put a netting over so sparrows don't start pecking into that. And you don't have to irrigate them. That's a misconception. You actually don't have to sprinkle irrigate your logs. As long as they're in the shade, a food forest is a great place to store them, or on the shady side behind the house. It's fantastic. Ideally not much draft, no direct sun on it to keep them moist, but you don't have to have sprinklers for them. That's not necessary at all. They can survive drought quite well. And then once you have waited for a year, then you try a few, put them in a bathtub with water, put some concrete blocks or something on them to keep them submerged in water for 24 hours. And then you take them out and then you knock them on the ground 3 times. That shakes them up. And then you put them vertically somewhere, again in the shade. And ideally actually in a place that's mosquito free, because there are certain flies, fungus, gnats, they look like fruit flies. They will put their eggs into the mushrooms and then you can't sell them, right? So ideally you set up a tent we used in the first years, a beach tent that is already mosquito proof by itself and shady inside, of course. Or you set up special grow rooms for it, but you want to keep mosquitoes out if you can when you get more into it. And then over the next few days there will be mushrooms coming out. In the first phase of production, the mushrooms will come out at the drilling points because it's the easiest exit for them. But later on they will come out anywhere. Yeah. So the first mushrooms will come out these holes here, and they will push the wax out and so on. But later on they come out anywhere. And each flush can have anything between, say, 3 mushrooms and 100. Anything can happen. It's hard to predict that. But the longer you leave them in between soaking, the higher the numbers of mushrooms that come with each flush. Now, when you have done your soaking and they have produced, then you put them in storage somewhere in your food forest again, vertically, leaning against a tree or whatever. Don't put them on the ground, again, to preserve the bark on them. You leave them for 3-4 months and then you repeat the same soaking process. If you don't do the soaking process, what will happen is all your 50 or 100 logs that you have, there might be a dry spell and then suddenly there's a big rain and they will all fruit at once. And then you don't know what to do with all these mushrooms. You can maybe dry them, whatever, but it's annoying. You want a continuous production. And to avoid these random big flushes of mushrooms after rain, you do the soaking, and you have a whole line of logs, and you take 5 every week and make them fruit, and then you put them back and you know where you stopped, and take the next batch, let them soak, and then have them fruit, and that way you go through your row of logs in an organized way, and then these random big flushes don't happen, and you have a regular supply of mushrooms, right? And then there's another thing with shiitake. Every strain has its own seasonality. Some are better for fruiting in autumn and spring, others are better for winter and summer. So depending what strains you have an emphasis on what season they do best. So if you can find strains for the different seasons, maybe you can, just like with different citrus trees, you find some that give you ideal production throughout the year. If it's for your home supply, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, then you can enjoy shiitakes almost on a weekly or even daily basis. And for us, shiitake is definitely the best mushroom to eat. It's fantastic. It has this, what the Japanese call the umami taste. You put them in a pan with oil and onions, and it just is mouth-watering, the smell of shiitakes when they heat up. It's a fantastic mushroom and incredibly healthy for you as well. So it has a very good balance between edibility, taste, and medicinal properties. So it's a must-have for every permie and homesteader and whatnot, and it's actually quite rewarding. And the advantage with growing them on logs is you don't need equipment of pressure cookers and flow cabinets and all these sort of things that normally shiitake growers use nowadays when they grow them on wood chips. Yeah, commercially nowadays they're mostly grown on wood chips, which can be mechanized and can be speedier than growing them on logs, more predictable. But the real connoisseurs of shiitake mushrooms in Japan, shiitake is almost entirely produced on logs, oak logs, because they know that the taste, the consistency is just superior to the factory-like production of wood chips as they do in China. There's no comparison. So for you home growers, the logs is the better choice, because anyone can do it, because the logs are naturally clean inside. You don't have to sterilize the wood inside, and it's the natural way of growing them. Yeah, so don't get started on wood chips, start with the logs, and that's how we do it.